and scribble things down. I've always end any presentation I give, I always like to end with where to go for more information. So that way nobody has to furiously scribble down every thing that we mentioned during the presentation. So wait for the last slide and take a snapshot of that. Oh, good stuff. So Ohio and archaeoastronomy. And so when Peter Pesch had pitched this, we were like, well, we don't know what the COVID situation is going to be next summer. And so I was like, ooh, we can even bring our portable inflatable planetarium, because the planetarium is, I think, where I naturally would want to share archaeoastronomy knowledge. But instead, we're doing it via Zoom, which is also great because then everybody's comfortable. But okay, so we're going to do a quick exercise first. So I work at a place called Observatory Park. Raise your hand if you've ever had the privilege of visiting Observatory Park in glorious Montville Township. Raise your hand if you've never been there. All right, raise your hand if you're not sure. Good, that should be all of us. So these are some snapshots from where I am an interpreter at Observatory Park. Thanks, Ann. And so we've made it a public park that's dedicated largely to knowledge about astronomy in the sky. Also about the Earth and weather, but mostly it's the park that doesn't chase people away at night. You're welcome to stay as late as you want and explore the night sky. And during the daytime, there are some interpretive features that show how ancient cultures related to the sky. And in particular, these are kind of the big ambassadors here, these sculptures recreating kind of ancient monoliths, the sort of thing one might expect to see in Northern Europe. In particularly, the artists who built these had the Kallanish stones in Scotland in mind. And these kind of bring folks in, because most folks, especially people who trace their ancestry back to the British Isles, they love hearing about archaeoastronomy, the ancient sky alignments and sites in Northern Europe. And I think that's great, but I would much rather talk about the amazing ancient sites here in Ohio. So this is kind of like the lure. We lure them in with the recreated Kallanish stones, and then we hit them with the knowledge of ancient Ohio astronomy, because these stones are all standing on earthen mounds, more in an Ohio style view of the sky. But enough of our phony baloney recreated sites to drum up interest in archaeoastronomy. Let's get to the good stuff. So what we're going to cover, I'm going to feature 3 sites in particular, which are known to have a connection to the sky and which you can actually visit. In particular, Serpent Mound, Fort Ancient, and especially my personal favorite, the Newark Earthworks. And this is just for fun. Raise your hand if you've ever visited any one of those sites. All right, anybody visited all 3? Oh, nice. Oh, this is a good thing to consider. Like I said, it's a great chance to explore Ohio and some of its history. And even if you've been there before, checking them out again with the sky in mind can add another fun dimension to your appreciation of them. Okay, so I did want to share one other anecdote about why I always start with the most basic introduction when I'm talking about archaeoastronomy. And this is a very nerdy story, but I think I'm among a sympathetic group. A few years back, I was, let's not get into why, I was talking to some engineers at a private university in Northern Ohio who are all experts on radio technology. And the elder statesman professor was showing some old electrical components, and he pulled out, oh, look at this cool old beauty. This is an old-timey capacitor, and peeled it apart and said, and they used isinglass as the insulating layer, pre-plastics. He's like, does anybody know what isinglass was? And I happened to mention, oh yeah, isinglass is the name for this kind of mica that the ancient Ohioans used in their artwork. So I'm going to circle some isinglass items here. Ooh, you might have seen this Talon icon on the along the pavement of the Health Line in Euclid in Cleveland. It's kind of a nifty feature from an ancient site. And I said, oh yeah, isinglass. The ancient Ohioans used to use that in their artwork. And then 2 of the experts on radio, they turned and looked at me like I was a square egg. And the one woman just said, I didn't think there were any ancient Ohioans. Which is an attitude that, we encounter far too often nowadays. It's a bit of a shame. I mean, these are folks who are considered, well-educated elites, members of our society, and it's perfectly acceptable to think that ancient Ohio and Native Americans did not exist. So it's kind of a bummer. I even have coworkers who will insist that there were no ancient Ohioans around, and then show you a box of arrowheads that their grandpa found on their farm, and there's no dissonance there. So for far too long, there was this turning away from the ancient heritage here in Ohio, and there was kind of an attitude that was very well lampooned on one of my favorite TV shows, on the show Parks and Recreation, which, again, you got to love a show that's about my line of work. And he expressed the attitude, history began on July 4th, 1776. Everything before that was a mistake. And so, yeah, if it doesn't have a European face, it wasn't worth studying for a lot of people for far too long. But that is now changing. It really has, particularly as we go into the 21st century. So there was kind of a corollary of that. It's one of my favorite quotes from the writer D.H. Lawrence is, what the eye doesn't see and the mind doesn't know doesn't exist. So it's far too often to say, well, how are you going to see something if you don't, know what it is, if you don't understand it? And for a lot of these ancient Native American sites in Ohio, that was kind of the attitude. It was, oh yeah, it's over there, but nobody really looked at it terribly carefully until the late 20th century. So you folks are going to get the crash course in ideas about how humans learned about how ancient people related to the sky. Because when we do that, we confront two unhelpful prejudices that we can kind of help to dismantle. And you can nod sagely if you've encountered this in the public or your coworkers or scholars elsewhere. Prejudice number one is that the ancient Native Americans never built a great civilization. And so they're like, well, they probably never got up to anything in ancient times. There were no ancient Ohioans, that sort of attitude. And then there's prejudice number two, which is not as pernicious, but it does lead to a lack of thought. And that's, nothing important ever happens in Ohio. So of course, there can't be any interesting Native American sites in ancient Ohio. So like I said, we can put these to bed. Let's get to some of the good stuff. When in fact, across the eastern United States, there was this flourishing of amazing ancient cultures. You could broadly think about North American history as kind of happening in distinct cultural zones where people lived similar lifestyles. There was one hotbed in the Southwest United States and northern Mexico, where folks developed what became kind of called the desert Southwest lifestyle. Up in the Great Plains, folks had a nomadic existence based around the buffalo. They're the folks who built the great medicine wheels. That's a presentation for another day. That's another cool archaeoastronomy topic. And then more or less Mississippi River and eastwards, there was this eastern woodland sphere where a whole bunch of different ancient cultures thrived and created ancient gathering places and artwork. The trouble is these aren't in very fancy places, so they tended to get neglected by the wider world. They're in places like Poverty Point, Arkansas, and Spiro, Oklahoma, and Newark, Ohio. Not the really glamorous places, and certainly not centers of power and scholarship. If these things were in Boston or Tucson, I think we'd hear about them a whole lot more. So some ancient sites are obvious, and that can be kind of obvious. All right, 1,000,000 bonus points if you recognize this ancient Ohio site. And then take it away because the caption reveals the answer at the bottom. This is the Miamisburg Mound in Southwest Ohio, tied for tallest mound in the Ohio River Valley. There's a near twin of this in Moundsville, West Virginia. So like I said, some of these sites are obvious, you can't miss them. But one of the phenomena that leads to the misconception nowadays that there were no ancient Ohioans and they didn't leave any great traces of their art and architecture is that most of the archaeological sites are hidden. Over the course of the 19th century, the building of canals and railroads and plowing things down was hard on earthen structures. So a lot of these things are now just hidden below cornfields, bean fields, and football fields, what we see a lot of here in rural Ohio. But there are plenty that are still extant and standing. And my favorite example of this kind of missed opportunity for folks to focus on the fascinating ancient Native American cultures of Eastern North America is this superstar archaeologist, Sarah Parchak of the University of Alabama. She wrote the not very popular book, Satellite Remote Sensing for Archaeology, and the much more popular Archaeology from Space. She's one of the premier experts on using satellite sensing to locate, trace, and study archaeological sites. And she's worked in Egypt and Babylon and with ancient Northern Europe. And she works out of the University of Alabama, where there are ancient Native American mounds on the campus, but nobody has applied this new satellite technique there to studying ancient Native American sites. It's kind of like, right at your feet. You overlook the amazing, amazing things we can learn. Okay, but we're going to get a crash course in archaeoastronomy. So stretch out your minds. I'll give you 2 words. History, in the kind of academic sense, doesn't mean stuff that came before. That's the written records of the past. And if you're studying Eastern North America, one of the downsides is written records only go back to about the 1600s and maybe the late 1500s if you're lucky. And before that, we have to rely on archaeology, learning about things based on their material traces. And so when I'm presenting this kind of a topic with high schoolers, I always have to remind them that archaeologists have a really tough job, and I don't envy them a little, even a tiny bit, because archaeologists have to look at an object and then infer the whole culture that went around it. So here we go. Here's a fun exercise. We're going to show you a object and see if you can infer its use. And I like to start with an object you might be familiar with, but imagine you're some archaeologist from the distant future and you find this artifact. You've got to infer what this thing is. What is it? Well, anybody who tries to build anything with it will realize this is a useless hammer. This is a completely nonsensical item to have. So you've got to infer that if this has no practical function, it must have some ceremonial function. So you'll hear, this is a ceremonial hammer. And I feel bad for the archaeologists just to find the gavel and infer the judge, the courtroom, and figure out this is how a society resolved all of its disputes. But again, even if you just hear that something has ceremonial function, it may be that we haven't puzzled out how an entire ancient culture related to that object, how it was structured, but we know that it wasn't just a simple practical item. All right, one last one. What do you make of the function of this item? This tiny shield that wouldn't protect a mouse. Right, it's a symbolic shield. It has some ceremonial function. This is, for signifying that somebody is for resolving disputes. So I feel really bad for archaeologists who have to infer the whole rest of that. So that's kind of what archaeology has to do. Archeoastronomy is one level more abstract. It's trying to study the extant artifacts and architecture of ancient peoples and try and learn what they knew about the sky. So for folks who haven't given us documentary evidence of what they knew, we have to rely on their art and architecture. And for the most part, it's things like this. Ooh, the nifty alignments that architecture and art can have with the patterns of the sky. And this is a very well-known one. This is the Angkor Wat city complex in Cambodia. And it has this cool alignment where on the first days of spring and fall, the equinox dates, if you stand on the causeway that brings everyone in and out of the city, the sun appears to rise directly behind the central pagoda, which is kind of a nifty architectural special effect. But it lets you know that people who made this had sophisticated knowledge of the sky and of architecture and geometry, that they were able to kind of put this in as a special effect of their architecture. Okay, one last one. Anybody recognize this phenomenon? This is the famed Manhattan Henge, which just happened again this week. And it shows the great pitfall of archaeoastronomy. So on about July 11th or 12th every year, the street grid in Manhattan lines up exactly with the setting sun. And New Yorkers by the thousands gather in the streets to take photos of the sun lining up with the streets in this cool alignment. And so it shows that it's just kind of a coincidence. Just because there's an alignment, it doesn't necessarily mean it was deliberate. And this is the great challenge in archaeology. We can't interview the architects in most cases. So how can you tell whether something is just a coincidence, like here in New York, where, yeah, the island of Manhattan more or less has this northeast to southwest orientation thanks to glaciers, and people put in a right angle street grid because that's a convenient way to move carts around. And so as a total side effect, every July the 11th, the sun lines up with the street grid. We shouldn't infer that July 11th was really important to the builders of New York, but again, when we look at an ancient site, it can be misleading. So we've got to have a healthy dose of skepticism when you find an alignment in architecture that it really was deliberate. Oh, good stuff. One last one. I pity the future archaeologist who has to look at this object and try and figure out whether any of these lines are aligned to the sky. No, in fact, it's simply a practical item, right? It's round because it doesn't fall down a sewer hole, and it's got a nice tread on it so people don't slip. And there's this curious animal effigy symbol in the center, which they'll probably infer had ceremonial values. But I pity the fool in the future who has to figure out who Mickey Mouse was. All right, enough of that exercise. Let's get to the good stuff. So the really serious scholarship of how ancient people related to the sky in North America kicked off with this gentleman, Andrew Ellicott Douglas. He deserves his own presentation. He was basically the Forrest Gump of American astronomy. He lived an extremely long time, for the 1860s to the 1960s. And over that time, it's like he was connected to everything. He worked with Percival Lowell, who discovered Pluto. He set up the observatories in South America that helped lead to the discovery of the expansion of the universe. His great-grandpa gave Benjamin Banneker his astronomy textbooks. It was kind of great. But one of the things he did was he was responsible for moving the beating heart of American astronomy to the desert Southwest in Arizona. And as a sideline, what he would do in the daytime and during cloudy days, he would investigate ancient archaeological sites in the desert Southwest. And in particular, he started looking at tree rings and the sunspot cycle and started connecting how old these sites were with cycles in the sky. And that kicked off this new field of thinking where people are like, hey, yeah, we can infer what ancient people knew about the sky by investigating these sites. It's pretty cool. So it took off again in the mid-20th century. This is the extremely boring timeline. But again, because astronomy was centered in the desert Southwest, it really was the center of scholarship for our archaeoastronomy. Partly because folks like an amazing scholar named Anthony Aveni were making amazing discoveries on the sky watchers of ancient Mexico and Mesoamerica. And those scholars overlapped a lot with the people studying the desert Southwest and northern Mexico. And that's where all the astronomers were. So places like Chaco Canyon from the 60s to the 80s became these great centers of study. They're like, wow, ancient Native Americans really did know a lot about the patterns of the sky and encoded it into their architecture. But it had an unfortunate side effect because it made everybody focus on the Southwest to the exclusion of the rest of North America. So I've summarized that in my favorite meme cartoon. Scholars just could not get past Chaco Canyon. It was like, oh, okay, Chaco Canyon, Chaco Canyon, Chaco Canyon, and nobody was looking for alignments in other places. Fast forward a little bit to where these folks are developing here in Eastern North America. And starting in the 70s and 80s, a few scholars start checking out some of these sites. In particular, the great dynamic duo of Hively and Horn that we'll be talking about a little bit later. But all right. And there was kind of a current in American society that was like, no, we really should be looking at these sites in the Eastern Woodlands. I like to point out a great Ohio resident here who also deserves his own presentation, George Lennox Crookham, who looks like he would teach at Hogwarts, but he lived in Jackson in Southern Ohio and would conduct early archaeological studies in the 1840s of some of the traces of the great mound enclosures and mound complexes in Marietta and Portsmouth and Piketon and Newark, and contributed to some of these old mapping things. And like I said, again, another instance of somebody being a real life Forrest Gump of scholarship. One of his young wards was John Wesley Powell, who would go on to map the Grand Canyon and explore the ancient Native American traditions of the desert Southwest. So it's just kind of cool. Another cool Ohio connection. If you're ever in Jackson, Ohio, there's a nifty little museum devoted to him and his life. But starting in the 1840s here, folks started to make a few maps of these earthen sites that were being, before they were being demolished. This is actually one of the first books that the new Smithsonian Institution published in 1847, 1848. And it was called Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, in the old sense of the word valley, where valley meant essentially watershed nowadays, the Mississippi River watershed. And it's one of the most influential primary sources in American archaeology. Everybody refers back to the maps. Nowadays, nobody refers to the text of the document because, well, it was another one of those great historic blunders. For a long time, scholarship, especially from East Coast US scholarship, just assumed that any of these great architectural features folks were finding in the Ohio country and westward must have been made by ancient white people. They couldn't have been made by the ancient Native Americans. That was just absurd to them. I mean, there's even text in here where they just assume they found that in some of the mounds, Native Americans had pluckily dug holes and buried some of their ancestors in there. The nerve of those people. Because there was this myth that the mound builders had been some lost tribe of Israel or wandering Vikings, anything but ancient Native Americans in Ohio. It took a long time for that myth to be dispelled. And regrettably, there's still a lot of corners of the internet where it continues. But anyway, so we've got the maps. Folks are starting to look at ancient Ohio sites, and there were a lot of these things. This is an atlas from 1914. It shows where ancient sites had been found then. Like I said, like any map, it's incomplete. There are plenty more archaeological sites over the borders in West Virginia and Kentucky. There are others that have been found since. But you might notice that there's a huge flourishing of these along the river valleys in southern Ohio. And this is one of my favorite, almost kind of a coincidence, but not quite a coincidence things. The density of ancient Native American archaeological sites in Ohio maps almost exactly onto another map of Ohio. That's the route of the Go Bus. Oh, wow. So I don't know if anybody, raise your hand if you've ever ridden the Go Bus. Oh, that's okay. It's that rarest of American things, a publicly subsidized city-to-city bus route. It's for connecting small-town Ohio with the big cities and for low costs. But amazingly, it goes through just about all these sites where you'll encounter ancient Native American earthworks. So I like to say anybody who calls themselves an Ohioan should ride the Go Bus at least once and at least check out one of these ancient Native American sites. And the truth is, it's not quite a coincidence because those ancient travel routes are still the convenient travel routes. So whether it was river valleys or interstates or bus routes, that's still how people move around. Oh, good stuff. So like I said, there are so many ancient earthworks in South Central Ohio. It's basically center square on rural Ohio bingo. You're guaranteed in just about any of Ohio's southern counties that you'll encounter at least one of them. Many of them were plowed under in the 19th century, but a lot of them are still around and preserved and visitable today. Okay, so that's where the sites are. And then a quick introduction for those of us who aren't archaeologists, who built them? And this is one of those tricky things where this happened so long ago that we don't know what these folks called themselves or what languages they spoke. Calling them ancient Ohioans is the sort of the most general purpose anodyne term. They're ancient people who lived in what's now Ohio. Archaeologists have come up with a naming system, which is not great, but it's what we've got. That there were kind of three historical eras where there were different cultural flourishings and ideas about art and architecture changed in between these. The oldest were called the Adena, then were followed by the Hopewell, and then the Fort Ancient. Again, because we don't know what these folks called themselves, they're named after wherever the modern day locations of their ancient sites were. So a place called Adena Farm and the Hopewell Plantation gave their names to some of these sites. So here's the rough timeline of when folks are applying those labels. The Adena were the truly ancient folks more than 2,000 years ago. The Hopewell were this amazing flourishing between about 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. And then around 1,000 years ago, there was this additional cultural change called Fort Ancient, which is not a great name. We'll come back to why that's not the best name in the world and a little bit confusing. But you'll hear me saying Hopewell and Adena and Fort Ancient, and that's kind of a rough timeline of what we're talking about. Okay, the Adena, the oldest, they're named after this site on what was called the Adena Farm. And they were masters at raising large cone-shaped mounds. That's that large Miamisburg mound that we looked at earlier. And they left behind some amazing stone carvings and artwork. This is my personal favorite called the Adena Pipe. It's Ohio's official state archaeological artifact. So these were folks who were clearly devoting a lot of time, attention, and ceremony to getting large groups of people together and heaping up soil for ceremonial functions, whether it was gathering, whether it was burials. I like to choose my words carefully. There was literally a congregation of people to create these ancient sites by scooping together soil one basketful at a time. And like I said, these are the folks who made the biggest and often the most simple in shape. They were mostly cone-shaped, looking like a volcano. But all right, on to our three sites for today, which are not cone-shaped. Let's get to our first one. The Great Serpent Mound. Raise your hand again for folks who've been to Serpent Mound. Ooh. Nice. So again, it's amazing on its own. It's this huge snake-like figure. And ever since the 1800s, it's been lucky enough to be preserved. Partly because it's on a ridge top that was too steep or too soggy to be worth anybody's time for farming, but also because it was really neat looking. Even the most jaded European colonists had to agree that this amazing snake was worth keeping around. And so it has a connection to the patterns of our solstices. So to get the background on the astronomy of this, I'm bringing you back to where I work, Observatory Park, where there's this amazing feature in the pavement. Ooh, you didn't think you'd be looking at pavement today, but you are. So we put in the regular compass rose that shows where north, south, east, and west are, but then we put in longer lines in the pavement to show the patterns in where you'll see the sun rise and set. So there's north and south and an east-west line straight through that. And then those diagonals show you where the sun can rise and set. Because the G-rated version of the story that we tell little children is the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west, but we're all old enough for the PG version. The sun doesn't always rise perfectly in the east or set perfectly in the west. We've probably noticed these if you've been through enough summers and winters. The sun rises in the northwest in the summer, it rises in the southeast in the winter. So there's a zone, a sector, like a pizza slice of the horizon where you can see the sun rise and set. And if you felt like commemorating it, you could put in lines that showed where the sun rises on the summer solstice, where it sets on the summer solstice, far to the northwest, and you could extend those exact same lines. There's a nice bilateral symmetry to this for where the sun rises on the winter solstice and where it sets on the winter solstice. Very nice. So that's how we've done it nowadays. So if you found some ancient site that's slightly linear, it might suggest, oh, there's two alignments that are possible. Somebody might say, oh, this line is lined up with the summer solstice sunset and the winter solstice sunrise. Like I said, the symmetry alone doesn't tell you which of those two things was deliberate. But this is one way where you've structured it all around a single standing point. Everybody's supposed to stand on that compass rose circle in order to use these lines in the pavement. And that's one way to do things, but that's not the way the ancient Ohioans did. But they did want to encode, apparently, the sun's cyclical patterns in their art and architecture. So like I said, if you watch down our lines, you can see where the sun sets. There's a nice summer solstice sunset right at the end of that line of the pavement. And winter solstice is usually a little cloudier. It's harder to spot. And like I said, sometimes there's a coincidence where it's just a matter of convenience that there's an alignment. My favorite is that there's a lamppost at Observatory Park that casts its shadow directly onto the compass rose on the equinoxes. Not deliberate. It just happened to be exactly west of where the thing was. So let's check out two modern sites where there might have been accidental or deliberate sites. And I love doing this. I love when finding modern sites that are related to the solstice. If you've ever been to Lakewood Park in Lakewood, there are the solstice steps. And there was just a big gathering there this summer, as always. This little promontory sticks out into the lake in a roughly northwest direction. I'll draw a terrible arrow there. And some modern architects said, yeah, let's put in some steps that point exactly to where the sun sets on the longest day of the year, the first day of summer. And so that's a case where it's pretty clear that folks had that deliberately in mind, and it's the site of a festival nowadays. My other favorite accidental or maybe deliberate solstice alignment, the abandoned US Bank headquarters in Bedford, is pointed right at where the sun sets on the first day of summer, within a degree. It's amazing. I assume the architects had that in mind, but I can't quite prove it. All right, but let's get much more ancient. Here's where Serpent Mound is, not far from the towns of Peebles and Seaman. And if you want, they're both on the Go bus. My circle's off. All right, and here on the right is one of my other favorite things about Ohio. The entire state has been mapped down to the nearest tenth of a meter in the Ohio Statewide Imagery Program, where through a combination of satellites and planes flying back and forth, every square yard of Ohio has been mapped. So you're looking at one of my favorite images of where Serpent Mound is. And let's enhance if we look a little closer. There. So it's on this plateau overlooking Raccoon Creek. And this is situated so that it's a map plan view. North is up, east is right, south is down. And that's the shape of our serpent. Even today, after all these years, it's still remarkably well preserved. And you can kind of tell it's got a head towards the upper left, 3 main wiggles in the body, and then a curly tail at the south end. Now, when folks show these photos of Serpent Mound, they almost never go with this boring, bland map style view from a satellite. They tend to go with the left to right orientation photo. That's the one that's in all the brochures. But the downside to that is that gives the illusion that north is up in these photos, when north is actually kind of in the lower right. But it shows that, oh, nice. Serpent Mound happens to point exactly, the head points right at where the sun sets on that longest day of summer. So there's a natural kind of promontory to this little part of the plateau overlooking the creek, which points vaguely northwest. But then when the folks built the Serpent Mound, they deliberately lined up the head-shaped feature. Some folks interpret it as a giant eye for the serpent. Others, people like to say it's a mouth swallowing an egg. Whatever it's actually supposed to represent, all of the centers of those points point right towards the summer solstice sunset. And this is something you can verify just by visiting it any day in late June. The sun will set right there at the end of it. And then that was kind of nifty, and it was known for a long time. But then folks looked at the 3 bends in its body and realized that they point towards the other kind of seasonal watch points that you would have if you looked at the sun. So this is always a little bit weird because it's tilted away from north. So here, if you dropped Serpent Mound onto Observatory Park, its head would point off towards the northwest, towards the summer solstice sunset. And then the 3 bends in the body point towards your sunrises on the summer solstice, the spring and fall equinoxes, and the winter solstice. It's kind of nifty, but it doesn't assume that you're standing in a single spot like the pavement here at Observatory Park. You would presumably walk along the snake, and as you inhabited each of these different bends, you're kind of facing your different seasonal alignments. So this is a built-in calendar to this giant ceremonial snake. So whatever other ceremonial purposes that this amazing mound featured where folks would gather, it was also included its own calendar, which I think is absolutely amazing. And you can still visit it today. There's some archaeologists. This is the obligatory archaeologist photo where you see everybody's butts because they're always facing down into the ground. But that's Brad Lepper, currently the head of Ohio's Historical Preservation Office. And he's sitting right in the head of the snake, right on the summer solstice as the sun sets right out over that valley. And I think that's one of the niftiest things about visiting the Serpent Mound. Not only that folks were able to construct this amazing artwork as a big cooperative effort, but that it's got a built-in calendar. And of course, other people think this is cool. If you've ever seen the U-Haul vans for Ohio, the Serpent Mound Archaeological Site is the official emblem for Ohio, and it even has the solstice and equinox alignments marked on it. So you can turn this into a fun drinking game next time you're on a road trip. Punch the person next to you anytime you see the Serpent Mound U-Haul go by. And that seems to not have been unique to Serpent Mound. There are a lot of other archaeological sites across Ohio that incorporate that yearly sweep of the sun into it. It's a handy thing that folks across the world did before we kind of got dependent on electric lights and artificial calendars and bells and whistles that would tell us when the shift began and ended. When you followed the cycles of the seasons, it was much easier to stay attuned to them and incorporate that into your architecture. There are a few other sites where there might be solstice alignments, but it's harder to prove. So I try not to go out into the territory that's too speculative, but I wanted to bring in a Northeast Ohio connection. These are 2 ancient sites from that 1840s Smithsonian survey in Northeast Ohio. The one on the right is near what's now Mound Elementary School in Cleveland. There we go, that's a little bit red. And the one on the left is an obliterated earthworks on Conneaut Creek in Northeast Ohio. And what I kind of like is, again, we can't be sure, the site doesn't exist to investigate now, but there was an ancient plateau that faced vaguely northwest And then if you take the azimuth based on the survey that folks made back in the 1800s, there's a large earthwork oval with 2 apertures at either end, and that kind of suggests a line, which I just drew terribly, which would point almost exactly at where the sun set on the summer solstice. So again, we can't definitively say that this site is related, aligned with the calendar, or aligned with the solstice sunset, and that it's intended to be a calendar. But it's a tantalizing possibility that even smaller collections of people would have their own sort of smaller miniature sites that would encode that calendar, so you'd be able to keep track of the patterns of the season in your gatherings of people for other ceremonial purposes. It's kind of fun. All right. Now, I can't leave Serpent Mound and go to our next site before I address the big controversy that's been brewing, especially over the last 10 years. One of the questions since the beginning is, how old is Serpent Mound? When was it built? And therefore, like, who built it? And this is one of those things where people have had just about every possible idea over the course of the last 200 years. So in the 1800s, people found right next to it, there are several Adena-style mounds with Adena artifacts. And so folks naturally figured, well, it was probably that early Adena culture from more than 2,000 years ago who did that. In 20th century, the new revolution in radiometric dating came along, and folks could actually find dates for some archaeological sites. So in the 1990s, there was the leper study where they looked at part of the serpent that had been damaged in the 1800s. And they said, well, we won't dig any new holes, but we'll look in one of these old damaged sites. Got some charcoal, had it radiocarbon dated, and they came up with the surprising date of about 1070 AD. So that moved the creation day forward a few centuries. They're like, oh, well, maybe that was when it was. And then just in the last 10 years, folks have found a new study that pushes it back to, like I said, before 500 BC, back into Adena territory. So, like I said, the leper study found some disturbed sediments, and they dug in a spot that had already been dug in. And like I said, this is one of those data points of one, a data set of one. You had one exactly spot in the snake that had some charcoal that was dated to 1000 AD. And that was the basis for this whole conclusion. But then about 10 to 15 years ago, the Romaine study came along, and they took a little core sampler and drove it all along the serpent and took a number of different samples, about a dozen of them, and checked those for charcoal and dates. And that's where they came up with consistently throughout the snake this much, much older date, that this thing is more than 2,000 years old. And ever since then, the scholars have been fighting. Oh my goodness. There have been so many harsh words traded in the Mid-Continental Journal of Archaeology. Like, the editors of the journal stepped in and were like, seriously, you guys need to stop fighting. The consensus of just about everybody is that the older date is probably the accurate one for Serpent Mound. This is at least 2,000 years old, but that people have been inhabiting this plateau for the subsequent 2,000 years. It's not like this thing was built, then left alone and abandoned. So it's even into 1000 AD, folks were maintaining this thing and adding soil to it and making sure it didn't erode away, and possibly even changing a few features up near the head where there's traces of some old vanished structures, which is kind of nifty. But the things that never changed all throughout those years were those handy solstice alignments that were built into using this snake as a calendar. All right, now we're talking about Serpent Mound and archaeoastronomy. I should address two other ideas that you'll hear a lot about Serpent Mound, which have been pretty well discredited, but I should bring them up. Back in the 90s, when folks came up with that date of approximately 1070 AD, everybody jumped out of their chairs, and every astronomer was like, ooh, Halley's Comet passed really close to the Earth in 1066, and there was a nifty supernova in 1054. Maybe those are related to the Serpent Mound. And some people even tried to say that the serpent depicts a comet, which I have trouble imagining, but especially if it's the case that this thing is much older than just 1000 AD, these are probably people looking for connections that don't exist. Like I said, this is putting 2 and 2 together and getting 5. It's a little bit of wishful thinking on the part of archaeoastronomers. But one of the other nifty coincidences is that Serpent Mound turned out to be built right on the edge of the only confirmed meteor impact in the state of Ohio. That's where its own presentation, how that was puzzled out and amazing. But the reason why there's a nice drop off across Raccoon Creek for this plateau to look over is because it's on the ring of hills around the crater's low spot in the middle. So it's kind of nifty. So then a lot of folks in the ancient astronauts camp like to say that, oh, clearly the ancient Ohioans knew that this was an extraterrestrial impact site, which feels a little bit speculative to me, but it is kind of nifty that it was a crater that gave them the vantage point for their calendar built on the ridgetop above it. Whew, good stuff. So that's your introduction to Serpent Mound, and we're all kind of stretched out from that. I want to point out another site that has some of the best preserved solstice and equinox alignments in Ohio, and that's this site, Fort Ancient, which is right outside of the Dayton-Cincinnati area, and there's an amazing museum. You should absolutely check it out. But it's an earthen enclosure along a hilltop. So there's a natural feature, and then the folks built more than 3 miles of earthen walls around it with trenches and pits, and also lots of collections of wooden posts. And it was clearly used for all kinds of ceremonial purposes. One of the nifty things is at the north end, the apertures around those walls all around the outside. If you stand on the raised mounds here at the northern part of the site, I'm going to circle that, and look off through our apertures towards the east, they're aligned to some of those nifty seasonal sunrises. And so if you don't mind getting up really early and getting a little bit cold, I highly recommend going to Fort Ancient on the winter solstice. There's always a hike that the docents lead where you can actually go up and see this for yourself. So for the extreme skeptics who say that maybe there's no deliberate alignments to these ancient Native American sites in Ohio, this is one of those ones where you can actually go and see for yourself. And I'll put in a plug for that. Anybody who wants to check it out in the wintertime, there's always a winter solstice sunrise hike. The downside is you'll have to get up incredibly early, and it's usually chilly. Oh, nice. So that's the part that's open to the public and well preserved. Nearby, just down the hill, there's on the grounds of a YMCA camp, there's an adjacent series of sites that are called the Kern Archaeological Site, because the Kern family owned the land, where there were these big stone causeways of piles and piles of limestone in a figure which some folks say depicts a rattlesnake, if you want to kind of squint at the collection of stones on the right. But these two long linear features are both lined up with those solstice, sunrise, and sunset lines. And again, because they're very linear, we can't, you can't say, oh, it's only lined up with the winter solstice sunrise, because that exact same line also points to the summer solstice sunset. Same for the other diagonal. But the overwhelming preponderance of the evidence is that these were built in so that folks could use them as a calendar. When you see the sun set at the end of that feature, you know the turning of the calendar has come about. Good stuff. All right. Whew. We've covered those sites. I wanted to show one of my nifty favorite ones. There are a lot of other sites that have solstice and equinox patterns built in. That seems to have been a pretty common feature across Eastern North America. Folks wanted to keep track of the seasons for growing and planting and harvesting and the changes of the season. So that was one feature that you see pretty well dispersed in a lot of other sites. But there was one site in central Ohio that showed a completely different alignment pattern, which I like to point out. It really is kind of exceptional and nifty. It's not just the regular seasonal summer and winter sunsets and sunrises. It's something to do with the moon. Oh, nice. So this tends to come later in history. After the Adena folks, there was this flourishing of folks called the Hopewell. And like I said, you can visit Hopewell Culture National Historical Park in Chillicothe. It's amazing. Like I said, nothing I can say will come close to recreating how great the museum and visitor center is there. But these folks were part of a huge flourishing in art and architecture. They traded for art and materials to use into their artifacts from all over North America, literally from Florida to what's now Yellowstone, to Oklahoma, to the Chesapeake Bay. They made copper shapes. They even made these stone figures. Remember our friend here on the right, I'll mention him in a moment. And it seems like it's the Hopewell who actually created the site that's called Fort Ancient, which, remember before I said calling the later 1000 AD culture Fort Ancient? Well, they're named because originally it was assumed that they built the Fort Ancient site, which is not even a fort. And it turns out it's the least ancient site. And the Fort Ancient site seems to have been built by the Hopewell culture, not the Fort Ancient. So I really think the archaeologists need to relabel what they call these cultures, because it's just deeply, deeply confusing. But this Hopewell flourishing centered around 500 AD, centuries before and centuries after, they really got on a building spree all across southern Ohio and adjacent territories. They buried pet bobcats in some of their features who had been given collars. They made copper artifacts that they had retrieved from the islands in Lake Superior. They made some of those mica cutouts and isinglass that I mentioned before, which had to be brought up from the Appalachians of North Carolina. And they brought all of this together into these ceremonial sites, basically from Chillicothe to Circleville to Newark. Again, right along the route of the present-day GO bus. And many of these sites were necropolis sites. They were for burying the dead and gathering to pass on members of an elite caste who lived on special houses that were literally raised up above the rest of their settlements. But they also made the huge, vast geometric enclosures for some not entirely understood ceremonial purposes. And one of the biggest was in what's now the city of Newark. And so it's creatively called the Newark Earthworks. So this is just east of Columbus in the city of Newark. And this is that map from the 1840s based on a little bit of an earlier survey. And it covered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres, just about all of the modern city. Unfortunately, most of it has since been plowed under and built up and is buried beneath the city itself. But there were a couple, two in particular, of these large features that were preserved and are still around and visitable today. I'm going to circle one. One is the Circle Octagon Complex. The other one is the Great Circle. And there's a part of this square over here. So I confess, I'm really partial to Hopewell architecture because evidently they were gigantic nerds, just like myself, and really big fans of geometry. So they made lots of circular and square and truncated triangle shapes in their architecture, but in Newark, they tried something different. They made this Circle Octagon Complex, which is gigantic. In fact, it's kind of the poster child, literally, on the Ohio map of historic sites. The Newark Earthworks occupies pride of place right in the center of it. And that's the good news. The bad news is one of the reasons why this was never plowed under is because it's been used as a golf course for many, many years beforehand. So it feels a little bit disrespectful for somebody's ancient ceremonial site to be now where somebody plays golf. But hey, at least it kept it from being destroyed like so many of the other sites nearby. So I love this aerial photo because it shows it really well with a light dusting of snow. I say it was part of a golf course because it has since been purchased for public use and is now a preserved state historic site. And that whole legal drama of buying it away from the golf course just played out over the last couple of years during the pandemic, which was great because that means all the Supreme Court arguments were conducted online, so even anybody else could watch in. And it was kind of a fun historic irony to see the arguments folks were making against seizing the site from the country club. The country club owners were like, "You can't just come in and take our land. We've used it for..." Oh, right. That was the pattern in American society. Okay, good. So, like I said, former golf course, now a preserved site. But what's going on there? Well, this is one of the places where that artifact I showed before, what appears to be what's called, some people call it the Ray figure or the Newark shaman, who seems to be in the act of transforming himself from human to bear. This was definitely a huge ceremonial site. It's connected to roadways that seem to stretch almost all the way to Chillicothe. People would congregate here from all over Ohio certain special occasions for some kind of ceremonial purposes. And again, we can't be more specific because we don't know exactly what folks were getting up to, but there's a clue built into the architecture. So even back in the 1840s, they called some of these things the observatory mound, because there's a huge mound at the end of the circle and then large apertures at the other end. So here's my rotten photo of the observatory mound nowadays, versus it was a little bit taller back in the 1800s. So once you're inside the Newark earthworks, the walls are just high enough that they create this artificial horizon all the way around you. And they're not for defensive purposes. They must be for some kind of ceremony, and they just keep going on. I love this photo because it shows the people in the background, just how tall and how enormous this is. Nowadays with the trees, it's a little hard to see one from one end of the earthworks to the other. It's that long. And presumably the folks were keeping this cleared using burning practices back in ancient times. But nowadays, like I said, it's got a golf course on top of it, so there's a bunch of trees in the way. And in particular, 2 lines of that octagon have since been wooded over. But like I said, this is that circle just a little bit southeast of the big circle octagon. And it's one of my favorite examples of what you can do when you preserve a site. This one was preserved because it was used as the county fairgrounds. It was used as an army encampment, but it's right next to an enormous, well, it's been torn down now, but an insulation factory. So like I said, a lot of this site was plowed under the modern city, but this site here suggests a deliberate alignment to it. I'm going to kind of draw my circle here. It's a mostly complete circle with 2 extensions out front. And nowadays, that's right where the visitor center is, which is totally worth visiting. And then there's a raised triangular, or I should say 3-lobed mound in the middle, which sort of kind of looks like a bird if you squint, so it's nicknamed the Eagle Mound. But this is one of those sites that suggests, well, maybe the primary axis of your site from the mound out through the opening, maybe this was some kind of an interesting alignment. And folks surveyed it, they checked, and they're like, well, sorry, it's not aligned to any of the meaningful patterns of the sun. It's actually outside the range of where you can see the sun rising. So it was just kind of assumed, oh, maybe it doesn't have any alignments to the sky. It was just built that way for some other reason. But then come along in the 70s, and a pair of scholars named Hively and Horn, Ray Hively and Robert Horn from Earlham College over in Richmond, Indiana, they said, you know, somebody should really go and survey this site using modern methods in the 70s. And so here's another one of those great satellite images of the circle and the octagon together. And they did a new survey. And they said, well, we could use this as like a teachable moment of everybody's claiming they're finding alignments in archaeological sites. Let's, you know, show that maybe some of these sites don't have astronomical alignments. And so then they actually looked at their data and they're like, oh, wait, this site does have a single huge astronomical alignment to it. And I love this one. This is a LiDAR map the Geological Survey prepared. You can see the modern city around it, but it also kind of suggests there's this, I need to change my color, from the large observatory mound at the back, across the circle, through a causeway, all the way across this octagon. It suggests there's this primary viewing axis for the site. And folks, check this out. Hively and Horn looked at it and they realized, no, this isn't related to the sun. It's related to the moon. There's a much less famous cycle that the moon goes through. And sure enough, the circle adjacent to it showed a related alignment to one of the moon's other rising points. And this is kind of cool. This has been preserved in much more detail nowadays. Folks at the University of Cincinnati, it's called CERHAS, the Center for the Electronic Recreation of Historic and Archaeological Sites. They've made these amazing digital maps based on the LiDAR and remote sensing data of the sites. So you can now put these on modern maps and examine them in detail as if they were completely untrammeled. And so Hively and Horn said, all right, this is related to a phenomenon called a lunar standstill. And then immediately raises the question, what is a lunar standstill? Because in our culture nowadays, it's not something that's given priority. It's not something we talk about a lot. You'll hear people who talk about the solstices and the equinox, but what the heck is a lunar standstill? All right, most of us notice the pattern the sun goes through, where it rises and sets. It's high in the summer, it appears low in the winter. And you might notice something similar with the moon. The moon is kind of reversed. The moon appears really high in the winter, and it looks really low in the summer. But there's also a range of places on your horizon where you'll see the moon rise. Now, the sun follows its own particular pattern from northeast to southeast, rising and rising and rising every day, year in, year out, from solstice to solstice. The moon follows a greater sweep, that same pizza slice sector shape on the horizon, but it does it over a much longer period of time. This is one of my favorite extremely long photo projects. It was taken by an astronomer in Greece, showing the extreme points of where the moon can be seen to rise from a certain site. And the downside is it takes 9.5 years to go from one of these photos to the other. It takes a very long time for this cycle to be observed. So if you map that onto here at Observatory Park, where we've got our alignments, you'll notice there's a change in where the moon can rise from being in a narrow range on the eastern sky to a few years later across a huge swath of the sky. And so those were given the name standstills, because solstice is basically a way of saying the sun stands still. And this is an analogous feature of the moon. So here's how I like to conceptualize it. We stood in one spot at what's called the lunar maximum times. Over the course of 1 month, the moon will go from its farthest rising point, farthest to the north that it ever gets in its entire cycle. And then within a month, it'll be rising as far to the south as it ever goes. It goes over this huge 77-degree sweep across the horizon, which, if you're a moon watcher, is an amazing special effect to see. Every day it rises in a different spot. And then that wedge, that sector, will gradually narrow over the course of the next few years until about 9 years later, it's shrunk to a minimum. And it's only going about 49 degrees across the horizon. And then it'll kind of repeat itself. So to see this cycle repeats takes about 230 full moons, which is like 18.6 years. You'll hear that figure tossed around a lot. I prefer to think of it as every 230 full moons, this cycle repeats itself. So that pattern, if you're a really avid moon watcher, there are the extreme points where you'll see the moon rise and where you'll see it set. And that suggests, like I said, 4 points for each of these events. 2 rising and 2 setting points for each, 1 for the maximum, 1 for the minimum. That suggests 8 points around your horizon. And if you think like the ancient Greeks, that means a single location and 8 azimuths radiating out away from it. But like I said, that seems to not have been how the ancient Ohioans conceptualized it. You could take those 8 points around the horizon, and yeah, you could build a single viewing spot in the center and point to them, or you could convert them into a nifty octagonal feature. Now, I do love this. This is a modern example where the University of Massachusetts at Amherst built their own kind of faux ancient site to show how people could mark this. And they went with the central viewing spot and azimuth technique for putting out a stone that would mark the southernmost place where you'll see the moon rise and the northernmost place where you'll see the moon rise. But it seems like the ancient Ohioans used a different strategy. And I'm mentioning this because the next lunar maximum is coming up in April of 2025. So mark your calendars. The last time this happened was back in June of 2006, when the moon hit its northernmost rise point of the horizon. Ever since then, it's been sliding back south. But like I said, April 2025, it's worth marking your calendars and making the trip to Newark just to see it. Because Hively and Horn did this study back in the 70s and 80s, and it was one of those things where they predicted it about 15 years before the next maximum was set to occur. So folks got to verify this in 2006, that by golly, if you stand at the observatory mound, the full moon rises right at the end of the entire earthworks complex when it reaches its northernmost point of its entire cycle. So one last thing about the astronomy here. Why does this happen? Well, our modern conception of why this the moon goes through this cycle is that it's related to the reason why we don't get an eclipse every month or twice a month. There's a slight tilt between the Earth's orbital plane and the moon's orbital plane. Or my favorite way of thinking it is that the moon has a different North Star than the Earth does. If you're on the moon, your North Star isn't Polaris, the Earth's current North Star, which I'm going to circle over here. The moon actually has this anonymous hardworking star in the constellation Draco. There's about a 5-degree tilt to it. And because of that misalignment, there's a slight wobble or precession. If you want to look at the fancy word for it, is nutation to the moon's orbital plane compared to ours. So for folks who like eclipses, that explains why most of the time your full moon is either above or below our shadow when you don't get a perfect eclipse alignment. But that nutation of the moon's orbital plane takes about 230 full moons to revolve back around. One of the consequences then, if you spend your whole life living on planet Earth, there's a 18-year, 230 full moon cycle in where you will see the moon rising and setting across the horizon. And what the Hively and Horn study in the 70s found was, by golly, the main axis of the circle-octagon complex points right to the maximum northern moonrise. Now, it's kind of nifty, but it could be a coincidence. We should be nice and skeptical. You'd expect that if it were deliberate, there would be similar moon alignments at the site. And the amazing thing is, there are in abundance. That the Great Circle just southeast of here is its aperture is pointed to the minimum northern moonrise. Like I said, that comes 9 years after the maximum northern moonrise. And then what's more, if you walk along the perimeter of the circle octagon in a kind of precession, you'll notice that there, instead of our main axis pointed at the northernmost possible moonrise, as you walk along, many of those walls then point to the other moon rise and set points. Like I said, those 8 directions around the horizon. So instead of going with a spoken wheel model like the ancient Greeks did, the ancient Ohioans went with this stations of the octagon that you can walk along and face all the different directions wherein the moon can rise and set. And like I said, that was a great prediction back in the 70s and 80s. In 2005, 2006, the phenomenon recurred, and by golly, it happened just as predicted. So it was this cool, amazing thing that this huge earthwork, which is amazing and gorgeous and worth preserving in its own right, is actually this enormous lunar calendar marking an extremely long cycle. And one of my favorite bits of corroborating evidence for the extreme skeptics is that there's actually a slight deviation from it being a perfect octagon that kind of hints that this really was a deliberate alignment. So I love this painting that the State Historical Society created to show what the whole Newark complex would have looked like back around 500 AD when folks were using it as this amazing center of congregation. And there's some thinking by archaeologists that keeping track of that lunar cycle was key to timing when people would gather for these ceremonial events from all over. Good stuff. And like I said, it's built into all across the site. So one of these cool things is, all right, so how do these folks do it? So just to nerd out, this is a fun geometry exercise. And I've done this with summer campers on a smaller scale. And if you want, if you got a big open field, a couple of friends and some string, you can make your own octagon like the Newark earthworks. So you start out, lay out the alignment that's important to you, like the northern maximum moonrise. Get your friends to draw a perpendicular line to it by stretching out some string into a circle. Do that on both sides, and then connect the 2 dots, and you've got a right angle. Super. The Hopewell did that in lots of other places where they made squares and right angle enclosures. That's great. But the builders at Newark took on a nifty new concept. They're like, okay, draw a certain circular radius around it, make a square inside it that connects the dots. And there's a similar square, like I said, that's at the eastern end of the Newark complex, which is almost an exact twin of this square that would be inside the octagon as an intermediate construction stage. And then the fun part is you take that same radius, have your friends go around to the different vertices of the square, draw a bunch more circles, and then where they intersect gives you an equilateral octagon, just with different angles. It's kind of cool. And so it could be a coincidence, some folks were saying. Maybe the ancient Hopewell, they were really into geometry. Maybe they just liked octagons. Maybe they just threw down an octagon on the map and it happened to align with the cycles of the moon. Maybe it's a Manhattan-Henge thing, right? They just like this geometry and maybe the sky alignment is different. But here's my favorite example of a random octagon. This is the kind of a real life example that or experiment that I don't think was deliberate. The people who built Benedictine High School in Cleveland built a similar octagon shape, but it was kind of dropped onto the map at random, and it shows absolutely no alignments to the cycles of the moon. What it does kind of show is, well, it lines up more or less with the north, south, east, west street grid, and it might have a cross shape in the middle, which you might infer had ceremonial value to the builders of Benedictine High School. But it's like showing you, if you just drop a random octagon down on the map, it doesn't guarantee that it'll line up with the cycles of the moon. And folks did a Monte Carlo computational study in 2014. What are the odds if you just dropped a random equilateral octagon down onto the map that it would line up with the cycles of the moon? And the odds are much less than 1 in a million. So this seems to be a very deliberate thing that the Newark earthworks builders had in mind. And my favorite corroboration to this is that the northwest point in the earthworks is actually slightly deviated away from perfection. And this is kind of, to me, this is the exception that proves the intent. It's kind of like how, remember that Angkor Wat sunrise I showed you? Well, the Angkor Wat temple complex is actually oriented about a degree south of due east, because if it was arranged perfectly east, the sun wouldn't appear to rise right behind the building. It would actually miss the building. So to create that cool architectural special effect, builders of Angkor Wat had to shift the design just about a degree in order to make it line up and make a nice aesthetically pleasing alignment. And similarly, the folks who built the Newark earthworks had to move the northwest corner about 20 feet away from where it would be if it were a perfectly symmetrical octagon, in order for it to have those 2 extra moon cycle alignments. So like I said, there's no way that people who were so exacting that they had some-degree accuracy in all the rest of their symmetrical architecture would have, accidentally shoved their corner out of hock by 20 feet. But it seems like that was something that was made deliberately so that it does line up with the cycles of the moon. And that's kind of cool. That's my absolute favorite archaeoastronomy site in Ohio. There's been some additional work by Hively and Horn where they're trying to connect the alignments that were found within the Newark earthworks complex with some of the hilltops in the surrounding valley. This might be true, but I don't know that it's definitively proven yet. I spent a lot of 2021 and 2020 riding my bike around to some of these sites that are alleged viewing hilltops. It's a good way to get a lot of up and down the hills exercise, but I don't know that these are great observation sites. Again, it could be true. Good stuff. But I want to point out, those are those discoveries that we already know about, but I am optimistic that we are facing some future discoveries. So this is where we wrap up, finally. I've been talking for way too long. There's the beginnings of a golden age for new techniques in archaeology. I'm predicting this is going to be at least as revolutionary as radiocarbon dating was back in the 20th century. Folks are using the new technologies that collectively are called GIS, Geographic Information System, to find, explore, and check the alignments of ancient archaeological sites, whether it's from LiDAR shot from airplanes or near-infrared photography from satellites. Folks are uncovering the actual traces of the archaeological sites that are hidden underneath cornfields and soybean fields. So there's no need to rely on ancient survey maps from the 1800s. You can actually discover unmapped sites. And in 2012, this is my favorite example of this. This is the first time I've been able to find somebody found an ancient archaeological site from a Google Earth image. Just by looking at the satellite imagery, somebody said, hey, near the Pickaway County Airport, there's what looks like part of a square and 2 circular features. Maybe that's an old site. And then the folks went out and did an in-person survey, and by golly, there actually was. It's kind of cool. And it was repeated again along the Scioto River. Folks found another previously unmapped thing. It's been done at the Hopewell Mounds Culture National Historical Park, where folks have found previously unmapped circular enclosures within the complex. It's been awesome. So folks like Jared Burks here are walking back and forth over these fields where the satellites hint that there might be sites, and doing these extremely sensitive magnetic surveys that then yield, yeah, there's a lot of compacted earth in these, preserving some of these sites. So some of these sites that appear to have been obliterated actually do have their bones visible if you can use the right tools to find it. So I'm really excited that this is going to find more archaeological sites and lead to better, more accurate maps. And once you have more accurate maps, you'll learn a lot more about how sites connected to each other, how folks migrated from one to the other, and are any of them connected to the sky. So keep watching this space. This is going to be really cool to see. Whew. So thank you very much. You put up with a lot of my nonsense. So here, as promised, is the where to go for more information. I highly recommend visiting a couple of these sites. Like I said, you can visit Serpent Mound, the Newark Earthworks, Fort Ancient, and for the broader cultural context, Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. There's also an amazing site called Sunwatch Village just outside of Dayton that preserves some of the wooden post-based archaeoastronomy of later Native American cultures, like the Fort Ancient folks who were part of a broader Mississippian context later and into the historic era, where you can find out about the sky lore of the Miamia and the Eastern Shawnee and the Seneca. There's been a real resurgence in preserving the sky lore of the Native Americans who inhabited Southern Ohio in centuries past. Oh, it's been really cool. There's even a nascent Shawnee Cultural Center going in Southwest Ohio that I'm really, really excited to watch this go. So that's visiting if you want to explore with your feet or with the Go Bus. If you want to do some reading, my favorite ones, I feel like I'm doing a Reading Rainbow segment. There is a phenomenal coffee table style book called Hero, Hawk, and Open Hand. It was an Art Institute of Chicago exhibit a few years back that preserved not only amazing photos of all kinds of cultural artifacts, but it has a great chapter just on the Newark earthworks by none other than Hively and Horn. If you only read one book about Ohio archaeology, make it Ohio Archaeology, which is the greatest introductory book to the site. Again, has a great chapter on the Newark earthworks as well. It's a little dated, but a lot of the material is still pretty great. There's one book that I'll only sort of recommend. If you want to read about the Newark earthworks, there is a book called The Newark Earthworks. And so there's a collection of essays. Most of them feel like that story of the blind men trying to feel the elephant. There's a lawyer interprets the Newark earthworks as a legal center. A person who's into architecture interprets it architecturally. But there is a nice short chapter by Dr. Hively on the archaeoastronomy of it. Oh, nicely done. And if you want the short version, if you actually visit any of these cool visitor centers, you'll get the nice, handy new booklet, The Guide to the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks of Southern Ohio. Like I said, available only at the gift shops in the visitor centers. It's one of those things where it's totally worth visiting just to get these small published books. Phew! All right, enough of me. Time to listen to what these nice have to go. Oh, nice! Well, thanks, and I'll turn it over to you. If you folks have any other questions and comments, I really like AW's mention of checking out maps, because yeah, like I said, this is going to be a nifty new golden age of seeing maps of where these sites actually are and how they relate to historic sites. All right, so enough from me. I'll turn it over to you nice folks.
Chris, thank you very much. That was a, there's a lot of information that was passed out there. There's some interesting earthworks remnants or small earthwork collections here in northeastern Ohio. I know there's a couple at Lake Metro Parks, one at Indian Point. There's a small hilltop enclosure, and then at Hogback Ridge, there's a small hilltop enclosure too. But as I mentioned to you before the meeting, I spent 7 years or so working in Greene County, and Bob Reardon. Do you know Dr. Bob Reardon?
I'm aware of his reputation, but we've never actually met.
Oh yeah, he was a friend of mine. I invited him to do some work there at Indian Mound Park at the Pollock Works, which was a hilltop enclosure, and he actually was very involved with the Kern site down at Fort Ancient.
Nice.
Oh yeah. So I got some. So one of the things that almost consistently turns up at these sites when the archaeologists are doing their work.
Mary, can I call you back in a few minutes?
Mute yourself, Danny.
Right, will do.
Anyhow, is there's almost always the presence of this red ochre in the construction of the mounds. Has anybody done any kind of geologic research on trying to figure out where that came from.
That's a good question. I have a good homework assignment now. I'm not aware of any, but I'm not going to fall for the trap that just because I haven't heard about it doesn't mean there isn't.
But you're familiar with that substance, right? That's
Yeah.
incorporated oftentimes almost as a layer. When Reardon was doing his work excavation at the Pollock Works, you could see the actual baskets, you know, that were deposited, the baskets full of dirt as they were laid down in little lenses. And then the whole thing was covered with several inches of this red ochre. And that's what he called it. And it was like almost like a burnt clay kind of stuff. So yeah, if you find out anything, just let me know. That'd be great.
Yeah,
Anybody else have any other questions?
I know the earthworks always look green nowadays. And there's even a cool site. There's another octagonal site called the High Bank site. It's adjacent to Hopewell Culture National Historical Park in Chillicothe. You can't actually go on there, but there's like a viewing platform, and they've done interpretive plantings. I love it. They put different plants and different mowing patterns on what was the earthworks. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of see the shape of it in the plants. So for me, I was associating the earthworks with greenery. They look green, but you're right. It seems like when they were built, when the archaeologists look at them, they would have been made of just bare soil that was either covered in red ochre, sometimes yellow clay, or it was tamped down and then baked and like fired in place. So yeah, we're used to seeing the earthworks green, but that's not how the original occupants would have seen them. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. I'll look and see if anybody knows where the red ochre came from.
Yeah. Yeah. Couple comments. One is, you know, with this Hopewell culture, excuse me.
No problem.
You know, obviously 2,000 years ago, there was something huge going on in Ohio with these gigantic, geometrically formed earthworks built by hand, this continental exchange network of exotic goods, and that were destined to the elite of Hopewell society. The geometry that went into this, and yet these become the subject, well, you know, something that you would see on the Discovery Network of ancient aliens, in like that the native peoples prehistoric times in our continent were incapable of such things. So that's, I think, just racist and terrible. But also along that line, it's like this, again, something huge was going on here 2,000 years ago that obviously just had tremendous cultural energy. And yet in our school curriculums, you know, maybe third or fourth grade, you get 2 pages on the earthworks as oh, well, wasn't this marvelous? But not really delving into it in terms of what was going on. And is this due to a long-running perpetuated prejudice, or is this more due to the excruciatingly slow migration from academia to common knowledge? And that's, you know, I guess, leave it there. But
yeah, I think you're totally right. There was, like we said, the eyes don't see what the mind doesn't know, and for a long time, folks didn't. I won't pretend to be an expert on this, but here's my totally amateur opinion: is that for a long time, you know, when the settlers who actually moved into Ohio and built farmsteads, they came in after the army had relocated and forced most of the indigenous inhabitants off already. So they could believe that there was this unpopulated promised land for them. It felt like a land without a people. So it was easy to perpetuate that myth. And then confronting the fact that you've got ancient giant earthworks in your backyard was kind of awkward. So it was just, everybody agreed, let's just not notice that we're on the traces of an ancient civilization. It's one step from that to maybe it wasn't such a crime, you know, driving off their descendants and saying, well, there weren't really people here. I know, yeah. It was the great making of them invisible. And then you're right, when academia is so slow to popularized this, or at least they were all through the 20th century. That seems to be changing now. That then leaves a void. And so then when somebody asks, hey, what's up with Serpent Mound or these ancient earthwork sites, it gets filled by, like you said, the History Channel tinfoil hat type of ancient alien stuff, or maybe it was giants or Nephilim or anything other than a cool cultural fluorescence of ancient Native Americans.
Yeah. Well,
Chris,
great job, Chris.
Thanks for watching.
Killed it. It's every bit as fascinating and engaging as I knew it would be, as you as my former coworker. So great job, man. Yeah.
that was good.
Thanks again. I hope you get to check out some of those sites. It's a good
Chris,
summer for it.
One question, Chris, looking at these things, the enormous, massive scale, all the material involved, the alignment, the symmetry, has anyone speculated how many people were involved, how long it took to build them, what sort of survey tools they had, under what conditions were they working? Were they prisoners? Were they slaves? Were they just people religiously motivated? There's just so many unanswered questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are folks who are they call themselves probably the dirt archaeologists, who not only actually get into the dirt, but they also have done studies on how long it takes to bring a basket of dirt at a time. And the one calculation that I heard was folks estimated to just build the walls of the circle octagon at Newark would have taken 100,000 person hours. So either, like I said, either 100,000 people working for 1 hour or one person working for 100,000 hours. But like I said, this was a massive public work project. I don't pretend to be as much of those are an expert on the archaeological aspects of what was going on in the culture. There's a lot of good speculation in, particularly in the Newark Earthworks book, on what folks were coming in for, that it probably wasn't like people being assigned to jury duty. It wasn't like some compulsory corvée labor. This seems to be something that people engaged in deliberately and joyously, like building a cathedral or anything else that is hugely culturally important to you. And it seems to be something that was drawn in from all over. It's not like there was a huge city around the Newark Earthworks. That would seem to come later in places like Cahokia and the later Mississippian world. There were big centers of habitation. But it seems like Newark was where people would congregate, make this massive earthworks project, and then disperse. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. But I would, if I had a time machine, that is my number one thing I would love to go see.
By the way, you had some great slides and some great graphics, really clear. I really enjoyed it.
Like
When I was working down in Greene County, Chris, it was not uncommon, in addition to Dr. Reardon, who was affiliated with Wright State University, and Al Tonetti at the time was with the Ohio Historical Society, or the Ohio Historical Connection. In addition to that kind of work that was being done there, I remember a surveyor, a retired civil engineer, who was going around the country and surveying these earthworks. And he offered no explanation, offered no conjure on what they were for or anything like that. But he was clearly spending the remaining years of his life trying to document these things as best as he could. And you mentioned GIS technology. Okay, one of the things that I think is incredibly important and exciting about this is this notion for an interdisciplinary analysis of these things. Because we had a philanthropic supporter of the park system that hired a dowser, an internationally recognized dowser, to come in and dowse all of these sites. And they were proposing that these things were geographically connected, not just in like a region like in Greene County, but the Greene County Mound was geographically connected to the Miamisburg Mound, which was geographically connected to the hilltop enclosure at Fort Ancient, and so on and so forth. And so I think your reference to GIS opens the door for interdisciplinary studies to help maybe unravel. And maybe, Dan, that goes to the notion of if that story can be more connected and compelling, maybe it becomes a much more intriguing and fascinating and profound sense of wonder there, you know.
Well, I hope we live to see it.
Me too.
And another example of that connectedness between these earthworks is, when Brad Lepper kind of discovered or brought to light this, the Great Hopewell Road, this earthen embankment avenue going from the Newark earthworks all the way down to the Scioto Valley various complexes. And that would be just, a physical feature. But yeah, that's there's so much more that needs to come out and again become common knowledge.
Well, you're talking interdisciplinary, and sometimes there's other intersections. But going back to Pat's question about how much time and effort went into this, one of the things I did in the past was I financed a lot of equipment for construction. And the point of that is that when you look at your vehicles, like you're driving, you count miles. How used is this? When was it built and what are the mileage? But with construction equipment, it's how many hours of use. Well, in Northeast Ohio, which is what I know best, I get down to around Columbus. It's about 2,000 hours a year is the maximum you can get out of a piece of equipment because of constraints of weather and daylight. I would imagine that if you're further south, you might pick up 2 or 3 hours a year, but basically I'd go with the 2,000 as a good round number. And so if you're taking 100,000, was it man hours, I think you said, Chris?
That was the
100,000
estimate, yeah.
man hours. And then you figure how many people you want to fit on a site at a time, how far they have to travel to get things done. Then you can start figuring that back on that 2,000 hours out of a year maximum availability, despite whatever else you may have to do with your day. So these projects, I would think, must have taken quite a number of years. Now, you mentioned, I think, an 18-year cycle on the moon, moon's positions. I would also imagine that even before they plotted it out, one of the easiest ways to come up with your geometry is you stand in your starting point and you have somebody hold a stake out there, say a little left, little to the left, move, no, back to the right, put it in the ground. And you come back next year and you put another one next to it. I can see them having a trail of 18 positions before they say, look, we've returned to position number 1. That's one point. So over their time frame, they had to have done a 20+ year study just to do the layout, to draw the picture on the ground that they were going to then build to. So you get to it, this was probably a multi-generational project, and as were some of the cathedrals of Europe for that matter. But it's just struck me that way. But just Pat's just tripped that little switch, like, oh yeah, it's 2,000 hours a year, bam, got it. I thought I'd share that because that's probably an area of discipline, like the people who clog up our highways with orange barrels that we don't normally think about. But I did have to deal with those guys, and they're surprisingly decent folks when you get to know them. But they measure their life in different ways. And it seems to be an intersection of interdisciplinary and various other thoughts that seem to tie in. And I would imagine that hasn't changed much, and that'd probably be a good maximum. But throw that into your pondering.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Chris, I'd love to spend some time with you at a separate occasion and talk about some of the other fun things that, I was on the periphery of down in southwestern Ohio, like when the guys found the post mold site for the sun watch. It was all just speculation, man. It was pretty cool stuff. But anyway, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for dialing in, and we will resume at our next scheduled time, and the official Peter Pesch will resume this chair. We'll see y'all later.
Good job as a host, Steve. Good job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Fascinating.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks, Chris.